briefly on Whitney Otto. Everybody's here, you already know her, but she's an author of 5 novels. And How to Make an American Quilt. And I might miss, so if I miss one, speak up.
Okay.
So, How to Make an American Quilt. Now hold on, because I have all these awards after them. And Now You See Her, The Passion Dream book, A Collection of Beauties at the Height of Their Popularity, and 8 Girls Taking Pictures, which we're selling in the back for $16, just if you want. And so a couple of trivia. She's been in the New York Times crossword puzzle a few times. She said this is the benefit of having a crossword-friendly last name.
Oh, yes.
She was once a Jeopardy question. Did they get it right?
Yes, they do.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah. I was just wondering. And
That's how you know your popularity. If it's going to be really hard, then obviously you're in a nosedive.
Yeah, that was, I hope it was a big question, like 200 or like the 1,000 one.
Yeah.
So, in Sex and the City, season 4, episode 7, in case you go back and look, her novel, The Passion Dream book, is a set prop. So, yeah, it can be seen. It's on the headboard of Carrie's bed as she waits all night. So, these are little things. And there's also a really funny story about a purse snatching and a blind person, and she's going to have to tell that one because it was kind of convoluted how I got the story. So I'm like, no, she needs to tell that one herself. So let's have Whitney Otto.
Thank you so much, Robert and Katie, and for coming out. And I really am honored that you came out on such a nice, warm, beautiful evening to be inside at the Pond House. So I think this is a story you mean. I don't know if this is the purse snatching, but I was at Fred Meyer one day, and there was this elderly woman, and she was standing behind me, and she was looking at all my groceries, and she said, "Oh, it's a lot of groceries." I'm like, "Well, yeah," and she kept sort of talking about it, and I'm looking at what she's buying, and she says to me, "Do you take the bus?" And I said, "Well, no, I have a car." And she goes, "Oh, that must be nice," and I said, "Yeah." And she goes, "Yeah, I take the bus." And I said, "Well, do you want to ride?" And she said, "Yes." And I thought, I bet you do this all the time. But anyway, so we go out to my car. She's really little and everything. And so I put her in the car and I seatbelt her in and stuff. And she's telling me where to go and I drive her over there. But as I'm driving over there, I'm thinking to myself that I could murder her and no one would know. And I didn't mean to think it, but I'm thinking, I have this stranger in my car. I can easily overpower her. I could break her like a twig. I could kill her. Nobody would ever know. They wouldn't suspect me. I didn't even pay with I paid with cash at the store. There's no paper trail. But anyway, so she's talking to me, and I'm thinking about how I could get away with killing her. So we get to her house, and I go to get her groceries out, and I go to, help her carry them in. She goes, no, I've got it from here. And I thought, oh, okay. So anyway, so she goes in. I kind of watch her go in and everything. So I guess it was about 3 months later, I had to go downtown. But before I went downtown, I had to run over to and pick something up at Lloyd's Center. And I got there right when Lloyd's Center opened. Like most of the shops weren't even open, but the thing I wanted was open. And I thought, okay, I'm just going to run in and run out because I got to make this appointment. So I go running in there, and nobody's around, but there's this woman, older woman, and she's not the same one, but she's sitting there on a bench. And as I start to go past, she says, excuse me. And I said, yes. She said, I'm blind. Can you help me get to the post office? Because there's and I didn't even know there was a post office at Lloyd's Center. It's tucked way in the back, underneath everything. It's like the Billy Goat Gruff Bridge. It's under there. So I go, well, and she goes, if you could just take me to the elevator, that would be great. And I said, sure, of course. So she puts her arm through mine. We're kind of walking really, really slowly to the elevator, and I'm thinking, oh my God, I've got to go do this thing. But I thought, well, that's okay. And so we walk in, we go into the elevator, and then I thought, I can't leave you in the elevator. And I said, well, okay. I said, I'll take you over to the post office. She goes, oh, you're so nice. And I said, no, it's fine. So we get out, on this lower level, and we're, walking slowly toward this place. And she's going on about how nice I am, and how sweet this is, and she didn't know what she would do because like no one else is around. It's really deserted and stuff. And I'm like, no. I said, really, it's fine. It's no big deal. And then I go, I'm not really that nice. And she's like, oh. And so I said, as a matter of fact, and I tell her this story about the woman that I was having fantasies about killing. And man, her whole body went really rigid like this. And she goes, I can take it from here. And I said, what? And she goes, they know me in there. And I said, okay. And she wouldn't let me walk her any further. And she like hustles off and everything. And I thought, I'm sorry. I was just trying to help you. But I didn't have enough conversation for the length of time it was taking to get her there. And since the topic of conversation being, oh, good Samaritan, because she's such a good Samaritan, I thought, I don't know. I guess maybe I am kind of the Samaritan type. Let me tell you a story. And so that's how I freaked out 2 women in Portland. I'm sure, telling people later. Yeah, and then there was this woman. She was telling me how she wanted to murder somebody in her car. I thought, yep, that would be me. But anyways, so I don't know if that was the story. I also had my dog stolen recently outside of Whole Foods, that hotbed of crime. No, I got him back, but but yeah, I know that was another story. I got a ton of them. I could do this all night. I don't even know why. Okay, so my novel, 8 Girls Taking Pictures. I just have my little cheat sheet in case I need it. It's a novel in 8 chapters, and it covers the 20th century, actually kind of by accident more than by design, but that's sort of how it worked out for me. And each chapter is devoted to a female photographer. 6 of the photographers are inspired by real-life photographers, and the last 2 are fictional. But the work the last 2 do is inspired by known work. So that's kind of their nonfiction, fiction kind of connection to the other 6. And this slideshow is really going to be showing you the nonfiction behind the fiction. So I'll only be talking about those first 6 photographers. And let's see, what else can I tell you about this book? I wanted to write a book that would be about women and art, but on a broader level about women and the choices they have to make when they have careers, not jobs, because I think everyone feels the same way about a job, but a career is a different thing, and it sort of engages a different part of you. And in this case, their work is photography. They have families, or they don't have families. They have friends, or they don't have friends. And so it's just sort of trying to see how you can hold all those things together. The other thing about this book is there's a lot about fathers and daughters in it. I have never written about mothers and daughters. People think, writing How to Make an American Quilt, that it was about mothers and daughters, but it never was. And I don't. It's not a subject that particularly interests me as a writer. But the father and daughter thing was really interesting to me, and partly because I stumbled across it when I was looking at the real life stories of these women. Almost all these women had fathers that they were quite close to, some in a not good way. The fathers tended to be very progressive, whether they were well educated or barely educated, whether they came from money or had no money, or had a whole range of kind of different kinds of belief systems. And all of them had this connection with their daughters where they were very, very encouraging of their photography and what they wanted to do. And this wasn't because they thought of them as surrogate sons. A number of them had sons. It wasn't that kind of relationship, which also really fascinated me. And a lot of these men also were inventors. Some of them were amateur photographers themselves. So you could see there was a real sort of simpatico between the fathers and daughters. The other thing that was interesting about these men is, as progressive as they were in many ways and toward their daughters, they very rarely were toward women in general or their wives. So it wasn't like they said, oh, you know what, you can do anything, and this is what I believe women should do. They weren't those kinds of men. And I think that what happens a lot too is when we look back, we tend to see always whatever's going on, in our time, and we look back at that time, we think, well, why wouldn't they make these choices or those choices? But, obviously that's like, we have the benefit of looking back, and that isn't how these men were. Let's see, what's the other thing? And the other thing I would say too is these 6 photographers at the beginning of the book, these aren't biographies, and they're not fictionalized biographies. For me, they're portraits. And they're portraits in the same way that a photographer takes a portrait. For example, if you see a portrait of Picasso, everyone looks at the picture of Picasso and they think, oh, it's Picasso, and he's sitting there scowling. and you don't think anything more about it. But if you looked at, say, a number of pictures of Picasso, you would see Picasso painting, Picasso wearing his shorts, Picasso walking around with an umbrella, Picasso laughing with his son. And you would realize at that time the photographer interprets the subject as much as a painter does. And so what the photographer is giving you is their idea for Picasso, what they want you to see in Picasso. They're sort of mining their own ideas about Picasso. And that's how I think about this book, too, that's why they're not biographies. If you're interested in their real life and their work, because you'll only see a little bit of it here, at the back of the novel, there is a selected bibliography, so you can look up books and read about them or get them out of the library. And you can also go online. And also at the back, the order of the real-life women's names are the same order as the first 6 in the book, so they follow exactly. And the final thing, too, is there are 8 photographs in this book. I would love to put in more. That's a whole other topic. But anyway, so I thought we'd just begin with this. So you girls taking pictures. And this is the first picture, and this opens the book. It also opens this little slideshow, and this is a picture done by Imogen Cunningham. It's called Unmade Bed, 1957. In my novel, this picture not only shows up, but it also is described. But in my book, it's a hotel room in Berlin in the early part of the 20th century. And anyways, and this is just a picture I love of Imogen Cunningham's. Imogen Cunningham was born in Portland. She was mostly raised in Seattle, and she's very interesting. She moved down to San Francisco. She's strongly associated with San Francisco. They actually have an Imogen Cunningham Day. She was a peace activist. She lived to be almost 100 years old. Okay, now if you feast your eyes this way, I don't know if this can lower at all. Is it as low as it's going to go? If it pulls back, will it go lower?
Actually, if I pull forward.
Pull forward? Okay. Okay, perfect. Okay, so this is a picture by Judy Dater. It's called Imogen, and she's the one on I guess, the left. And this is Twinka Tebow. So it's called Imogen and Twinka, Yosemite, 1974. As I said, taken by Judy Dater. Most people only want to look at Twinka, but but Imogen, this is the image that people have of Imogen Cunningham. This is sort of her kind of iconic image. She's got the little peace signs on her scarf, and she's got her Rolleiflex. And anyways, and this is a terrific photograph, that is also comes up in my novel, but you won't see this photograph in the novel. This is Imogen Cunningham, too. This is when she was a student at UW. She got a degree in chemistry, which is what you did if you were interested in photography then. There was no photography degree. And this is in the fields around the college there. And that was a self-portrait, by the way. I should say that, too. Okay, so this is Edward Weston and Marguerite Mather. Mather met Weston pretty early on when he was in Tropico, California, which is now Glendale, California. He had a studio there. He was married. He had kids. They met up. She's really, really interesting, and she doesn't appear in my book. But the reason why this photograph is in here is this is a picture that Imogen took of them. She knew both of them quite well. And they were lovers from 1913 till 1923. They worked together a lot. Mather is really, really interesting. She's probably one of the best-known photographers between around 1915 and 1935. She dies fairly young, but she's really interesting. And if you see her work, she works a lot with patterns and lights and objects. And Weston was very, very influenced by her style. This is Tina Modotti. And Tina Modotti was, she's a photographer also who met Weston. And one other thing I should say about Cunningham before I leave Cunningham is, in the beginning with photography mimicked painting a lot. They used a lot of soft focus. They used a lot of allegorical subjects. It was sort of trying to be high art in a way. And Cunningham, when she started out, was doing these sort of allegorical kind of pictures and the soft focus and that kind of thing. Somebody named Gertrude Casimir was sort of one of the big deal photographers at the time. Cameron was a big deal photographer. And that's the other thing that interested me about writing about photographers is, with photography, women were in it from the beginning. It wasn't a profession they had to break into. They were already there. So my concern is more what happens once you're there. Like, how do you progress from there? And eventually, Cunningham, along with Weston and Ansel Adams, and she was very close to him, and a number of other photographers, started this society called F64, where they did very natural photography. So she went from this sort of high art looking photography into this photography that only used natural light, that wasn't cropping, that wasn't really manipulating the picture either before or after in the darkroom. And then, of course, you have Mather, who did these sort of modernist things. And then Tina Modotti also was very modernist. She was born at the end of the 19th century, and she was an Italian immigrant. Her family was quite large, and they were very, very, very political always. And her father moved to San Francisco into the Italian section of North Beach, and one by one he brought the family over. And she was the third child and the third daughter that he brought over. And they had known poverty when they were living in Italy. And they did okay when they got to San Francisco. Her father was a machinist, and he was kind of an amateur photographer at times. And she ended up working for I. Magnin, and she was a seamstress, and she was a model, and she was also very involved with the local Italian theater. And through all that, she ended up meeting this one man, and they ended up going down to California, and she was in silent movies a little bit. She didn't do anything that was really, really noteworthy. But while she was down there, she met Edward Weston. And Edward Weston and Tina were sort of like the it couple. They were this very big deal. Once they met up, she was his muse, she was his lover. I mean, Mather was sort of kind of on the sidelines at that point. And they were very, very close. And he was teaching her how to take pictures. And so they had a relationship that sort of hit on a lot of different levels. Anyway, she was not that enamored of the United States, and without going into it too much, she ended up in Mexico City, and Weston said, if you're going to Mexico City, I want to go with you. And she said, okay. Well, Weston's wife, the mother of his 4 sons, said, you can go, but you're taking one of the kids with you. So they took one of his kids with them, and they took a boat down to Mexico City. And at this time in the 1920s, Mexico City is like this flowering of education and art and more liberal politics and communism, and all these things are going on. So it's a really exciting time to be there. There's a lot of expatriates there, and while she's down there, she ends up meeting a lot of writers and a lot of painters and a lot of political radicals, and she gets very, very involved with the Communist Party very quickly, which, if you look at her family background, is sort of a natural for her. Weston can't stand it. He is not interested in politics. He's not interested in the Communist Party. He's not interested in any of it. Cannot stand it. And they do live together during this time. They have a studio together. They're both taking pictures, and of course they have his kid. And also she's very free love, and that also drives him a little crazy. Okay, this is a detail of one of the murals that Diego Rivera did of the chapels at Chapingo, and this is Tina Modotti. And this pose and everything is reminiscent of photographs that Weston took of Tina nude, which were also shown in Mexico, which were, kind of a scandal. And anyways, these murals at Chapingo, the chapel there is considered sort of like the Sistine Chapel of the Americas. This is one of Tina's pictures, and one of my favorites. It's called Roses, 1928. And I love it because I like how it's really close cropped on the roses. I like the way that they're already in decay. I like the way they're sort of crushed together. And most of all, I like that it's a sentimental subject that has been leached of all sentimentality. But this is also typical of Tina. In the same way that Cunningham got into sort of natural photography, Tina's whole thing was very modernist and using a lot of patterns and not so much color. She did black and white, but like she would do series of doors or a series of telegraph wires or a series of benches, and she liked sort of these patterns that it would make, and patterns and shadow and patterns and shadow, and this sort of goes along with that. I mean, they're roses and you can make them out, but they're also, again, they're not a bouquet of roses. They're more looked at for what they kind of do within the picture that way. This is another subject of Tina's. She did a lot of photographs of the hammer and sickle, sometimes with the sombrero, sometimes with, the bandolero, and she did a lot of photographs of the people that lived in Mexico, and she was very, 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 very much about the people. This is Julio Antonio Mea, and this is a photograph Tina took of him, and it's very, very famous in the same way that the photograph of Che is famous. He's from Cuba, and he is a big-time radical, member of the Communist Party. He's younger than Tina by a few years. And they meet up in the offices of the newspaper where she's working, and it's just, it's just explosive. They are the radical it couple, and they have, people over to their house all the time, a big salon. Because during this time, too, she had always had other men, even when she was with Weston. At one point, Weston said, you know what, I'm done with Mexico, I'm going home. So he left home after about 18 months. And then he wanted to come back, and he came back, and he had a different son with him. Because, of course, we know his wife, if you're going to go to Mexico, you're taking one of the kids. And so he came back, and the second time he only lasted less than a year. But this was, this was sad for her. She really, really loved Weston, and she very much missed him and wrote him very heartfelt letters. But this was the big love of her life. And they were together for not too long, actually, because he does get assassinated. And he gets assassinated when they're in the street and walking down the street, and she has her arm through his, and he is shot out from under her. This is a painting by Diego Rivera, and it's called Arsenal, or Distributing Arms. And in the center, you can see Frida Kahlo. Thank you. You can see Frida Kahlo in the center. This is also in 1928, the same year that Roses is being photographed. But in the side here, this is Tina Modotti. Tina also was lovers with Diego Rivera for over a year, and he painted her a few times. She's looking up adoringly at Mea, who is in the overalls there. But the thing that's really interesting about this, and this is the thing that breaks up her entire friendship with Rivera, is the man who's looking over the shoulder and looking at them. He's a man named Vittorio Vidali. He's Italian. He was born not that far from Tina, but he meets her when he's in Mexico, and he's a communist operative. They estimate in his life he probably assassinated upwards of 60 people. And he had a lot of names and very slippery, and anyways, but this little thing that's happening here in the corner of the painting is why Tina stops talking to Diego for the rest of their lives. She says, you're exposing my private life, and she didn't like it. This is Medusa by a British photographer named Madame Yvonne. And Madame Yvonne was from a very nice family. She was a suffragette, and she started doing, like most of these photographers, she had a studio. Almost all of them have studios, and they don't get to just do portraits. They have to do they have to do advertising. They'll do magazine work. They do whatever is sort of there for them to do. And Madame Yvonne has a really great sensibility. I love her. I love her because she she uses this one system called the Vivex system, and so a lot of her work that she's really well known for is between the wars. And the Vivex system uses this kind of like highly saturated sort of way of printing, and she also is very, very whimsical. So her feminism always has this like this sort of sense of humor about it. And she did this one series. There's 24 of them called the Goddess series, and she took these aristocratic women in England, and she dressed them all up like goddesses and took their pictures, and I just have a few of them in here to show you. But this is like really typical of her, having this woman, and then she puts rubber snakes around her, and then she puts rhinestones on the snakes, and there you can see it in full. She's got the hot pink, sparkling background, and her stuff is just really, like I said, and it's really contemporary. It looks like it could have been done last week. But this is all, like I said, in the 30s. Here you can see Arethusa, and she's got the glass fish at the bottom. She has the illusion that the woman is underwater. She's got the fake flowers, which you see a lot with her. This is Daphne. This is Athena, and you can see Athena, being the goddess of war and wisdom. She's got the gun in her hand, but she's got the owl there. She has sort of a German helmet on because this is between the wars. And this is not as typical of her work, and this is called Machine Worker in Summer, 1937. And I love this picture so much. It's got these beautiful pastels in it, but also has the fake bird up in the corner, again, like the fake fish. She used a lot of butterflies. She had, fake stuffed heads. She would use a lot of fakery, that kind of thing. The fake flowers, they match the fake flowers in her hair. And it's also that kind of sly sort of suffragette thing she had going, which is that here's this woman, I'm working, I'm doing what I should do, I'm sewing, but she's not sewing anything, and she's stark naked, and she's just sort of running all this tulle through the machine. And this is one of her self-portraits. She did a lot of self-portraits. And in this one, she's really sort of telling you who she is. The frame is talking about sort of how she looks at her work. She thinks of it as artistic. You can see all the chemicals around her, the glass plates. There's a butterfly. There's one of the goddesses above her head. And I love the way she looks all the time. I just think that there's something always very appealing for me of people who are highly creative who don't necessarily dress in a very flamboyant way, which is a personal thing that you now know about me. Other self-portraits she did, for example, she did one of a giant camera, and she's really tiny. She did another one of her cat, and the cat's sitting there. And if you look at around the neck, you'll see her portrait is hanging around the cat's neck. So she did a lot of those things. Okay, and now we move to Greta Stern. And Greta Stern was born in Germany. I can't remember her exact date. I should be able to, but I can't. She was born in 1904. She's Jewish, so you can see where this story is going already. And and the woman that she's with here, Greta Stern's on the bottom, the woman on the top is a woman named Ellen Auerbach, who also is a photographer. They meet at the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus was a school in Germany, just outside Berlin. And what they did there is they taught kind of like arts and crafts, I guess you could call it in a way, but they taught photography, textiles, furniture, pottery, fine art. It wasn't all, arts and crafts kind of thing, and I'm using that in the best possible, highest sense here. The Bauhaus was really, really influential. It was very much about form and function, and it was a lot about not having sort of gewgaws on things. Like, for example, when you're in a house, okay, like when you're in here and you don't see any crown molding at the top there, that's the Bauhaus's influence. Bauhaus is like stripping everything down. It's very modern. It's very clean. And I mean, not necessarily if you see the textiles and some of the paintings and everything, they're not like all white. They don't look, that kind of spare. But the Bauhaus really influences architecture a lot, and really kind of like, sort of taking it down to its essence and only having what's necessary. So they meet there, and they're both photographers, or photography students, I should say, and they're just, all over each other right away. As friends, no one knows if they're more than friends, but they decide that they're going to open up a studio that specializes in photography for advertising. And this is pretty new at this time, because advertising is still using sketches and pictures. And so, but this is what they want to do. They don't want to be an ad agency. They just want to do the photography. They end up winning a couple of different awards, but also they're very young when this is going on. And the great thing about Berlin after the war in 1918 is bankrupt. And not only are they bankrupt, but every other country is handing them invoices saying, you have to pay for our war too. You started it, you pay for it. So they have no money. The streets are sort of full of these sort of, George Gross would paint Berlin as prostitutes, capitalists, and veterans. And that is a lot what Berlin looks like at the time. Berlin's a huge, huge city. I think it was like the 4th largest city in the world at that time. It's very huge. And they're broke, it's a mess, the Kaiser is out, and there's about 4 different political factions all sort of vying for power. And this is the Weimar Republic, which lasts until 1933. But on the flip side of this, there's a lot happening there. There's sort of like the new girl who has a lot more possibilities than she ever had before. It's a very sort of permissive society. As I said, everyone's sort of like trying to have political power. And somewhere in the middle of all this, in these middle years in the 20s, everything kind of settles down and comes together, and it's kind of great to be there. And so this is where they flourish. So as these young women in their 20s, they kind of have opportunities they might not have had in another time or place. And this was an ad that they put in their window. Greta's got the beard on, and Ellen has the wings. This is one of their ads. As I said, they won a couple of awards, and they're very much about more of a kind of a surrealistic collage. And collage is really big at this time. There's this German name who called himself John Hartfield, and he would do these incredible collages, and I do mean incredible collages. Mostly, the Hitler ones are great, but they're really, really interesting. There's nothing cute about them. There's nothing safe about them. And then also Hannah Hock was another artist who came out of Dada, who ended up doing these incredible collages. And so they're very influenced by this. And like you can see here, that it's a mannequin, it's a bottle, but it's a human hand. So it's not all, so there's always that little disparate sort of thing happening there. And this sort of represents the Weimar Republic. I mean, no place that I've ever read about has ever been as filthy as the Weimar Republic. And truly, there's a book you can buy, and it will tell you district by district what you could get. And it's stuff that you don't even think of as sex. I mean, it's just sort of like, you think, well, who would do this? Who would want that? But obviously. And so this is just a picture from that time. But this is in a club. It's a giant straight razor. There's flames under it. There's women in their underwear, and they're sliding down. But this is nothing. Trust me. So with Greta Stern, as I said, they're Jewish, and they start having a lot of problems. She's lucky enough to go to England. Ellen comes with her, but the English, of course, won't let her stay. So she ends up going to Palestine for about 4 years. And Stern ends up marrying a fellow she knew at the Bauhaus who is from Buenos Aires. They go to Buenos Aires. She goes down there. They can't really get anything going down there because they come from a very modernist tradition. They come from the Bauhaus. And Berlin at this time is very cutting edge and very modernist. Buenos Aires is like 30 years behind Berlin. And it's very sentimental, and it's very sweet, and they just have, there's just no outlet for them there. So she has a kid, and then she has another kid. And then one day, an editor of a magazine, which is kind of called Idilio, which is kind of like Our Lady's Home Journal, comes to her and says, you know what, we're going to do this column, and it's going to be about women and what they dream about. So we hired this guy who's not even a psychologist, and he is going to interpret their dreams. And we want you to interpret the dreams visually. So she, for 4 years, begins a series called The Sueños, which is dreams in Spanish. And you'll see the quality of some of these. They aren't very good because they were in magazines. Most of the originals aren't around anymore. There's some originals. And as a matter of fact, the Museum of Modern Art bought one of them 2 years ago. But they're great, and they're all collages, but most of the pieces of the collage are pictures that she's taken. It's not just sitting down and cutting out pictures. But it might not always be all the pictures that she takes. But you'll see what they are, and they're really about the anxieties of the middle-class Argentine housewife. And for me, I think this is one of the best documents ever of what it is to be a housewife, in this country as well as that country. You can see a lot of these online. They have a couple of books, but the books are all out of print. And if you find them in their use, they're pretty expensive. This is the one that the museum bought, and this is the one that's in my book. And this is called Electrical Appliances for the Home. But you can see the quality of it is different because it's an original as opposed to the other ones. And this one I love. She's playing piano, but it's a typewriter. There's the audience. Okay, this is Lee Miller. And Lee Miller was born in 1908 in Poughkeepsie, New York. And she has a life that in some ways mirrors Tina Modotti. She ends up being Man Ray's muse and lover and pupil. And this is a photograph by Man Ray. And the reason why it looks like this is it's been solarized. And what that means is that when the print is being developed, some light gets into the darkroom, and it creates this sort of halo effect around it. And she said that she discovered it because a mouse ran across her foot when she was developing pictures for Man Ray, but she said Man Ray knew what to do with it. And so they had a very symbiotic relationship, also very fraught. She didn't believe in sexual fidelity. She did get married a couple times in her life, but she really she really got married out of convenience more than anything else. And so she was very, very free love too. This made Man Ray so crazy. One time he was walking around Paris with a loaded gun. He couldn't stand it. They were together for 3 years and they stayed friends till the end of his life. But she drove him insane in the same way that Modati sort of drove Weston insane. And, but she got into photography through him. She really enjoyed it. She was a model in New York for 4 years. She did a lot of things in her life. Her life is really extraordinary up until the age of 40. I mean, it's really extraordinary. I didn't even touch on half of it. And, but also she was just so beautiful. And so that was a lot of her calling card. And you can sort of see that. The other thing that's going on in Paris at this time is surrealism. And surrealism is huge. And surrealism in books and art and movies basically means you're either depicting a dream or you're accessing your subconscious, either one. So that's kind of the short version of surrealism. And she's surrealist all the way. This is another picture of her from her modeling years. Okay, so many things happened to Lee Miller. Eventually she ends up in London and she's living with this guy and this other guy. The first guy's her boyfriend, the other guy is their friend, and the Blitz begins, and she wants to take pictures. She wants to go over and be a combat photographer. However, there are no female combat photographers at this time, so she can't go. So she contacts Vogue, who she has a connection with from her modeling years, and taking pictures here and there. She had been taking pictures all along, and she said, well, you know what, you can take pictures all over England. So she does a whole series of like people in the tube, or land girls, or field hospitals. But she can't go over to where the action is until the war ends and the Americans are there. So she says, well, I want to go now. And they say, well, okay, you can go. Now, this is what's really amazing is she gets over there. And, well, one of the first things that happens is she's attached to this American, what do you call it? Like not a troop, unit, thank you. So this unit, but they're still battling out with these Germans who are in a fortress who don't know the war is over. So, and she takes pictures. So technically she becomes the first female combat photographer, but purely by accident. And that's kind of her moment. So as she's going around Europe, she is traveling around with this other photographer, and she's taking some pictures, but he's really a photographer, and she's writing these dispatches of everything she sees. She's one of the people that goes into the camps. She's one of the first people going into like Dachau, for example. And the pictures she takes of the concentration camps and of the SS officers who've hung themselves, and these pictures are as graphic as you can imagine. And she did all of these for Vogue. And British Vogue, not American Vogue, but British Vogue was printing her dispatches of all the things that she was seeing and was doing, and seeing the different liberated towns and women who are tarred and feathered and all these things that are going on. I mean, which is like inconceivable today, but this is what she's doing. How can I say this? She loves what she's doing. This is like her truest self. All the things she'd done before. She was painted by Picasso 8 times. She remained friends with Picasso till the end of his life. She was in movies by Cocteau. She was photographed by Man Ray. She had boxes made for her by Cornell. I mean, she was a big deal muse. She wasn't just Man Ray's muse, and everybody knew her. She had her own photography studio at one point in New York. She lived an expatriate life in Cairo for about 3 years. She did anything, her heart desired. She sort of did this. But she ends up at this tail end of the war when little conflicts are still going on. And as I said, she just comes into sort of her truest self. Now, this picture is in Hitler's apartment in Munich. It's been vacated so recently, the phones are still live. And she and David Sherman, who's the fellow that she's traveling around with, they had gone down to Eva Braun's house down the street, and she describes Eva Braun's house in detail. And then they go to Hitler's house, where she picks up a number of sort of souvenirs, which you could still see today at her archive. Mm-hmm. And it like sterling silver platters with the swastika on them and AH, things like that, and flags and all that kind of stuff. But they go in there, she describes Hitler's place as this place that looks like it would take 20 minutes to wipe out any personality at all. And also she said the art was really shitty. But This is in Hitler's bathtub. David Sherman's taking the picture. These are her boots, and she said that she was washing off the dirt of Dachau in his bathtub. They do spend the night there. They end up spending one night there. And they sort of talk their way into the apartment. And the phone does ring at one point when they're in there, and David Sherman answers it, and whoever's ever on the other end hung up right away. The other thing that's, I think, noteworthy about this picture, as if that's not enough, is she's not even 40 and her looks are totally faded. She doesn't stay beautiful very long, and there's a lot of reasons for that. This is American Girl in Italy, which you've all seen, 1951. It's in Florence, taken by Ruth Orkin, and it's famous, 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 famous. It was also a controversial picture in its time because some people think that the woman who's walking down the street is a 24-year-old American girl who was an art student who was traveling in Florence and happened to meet Ruth Orkin. Her name is Jinx Allen. Was walking down the street, and some people think the men look threatening and that she looks afraid. Other people find it a very liberating picture. When feminism was hitting its heyday again around 1963 and beyond, this picture came up again as controversial for the same reasons. I'm one of those who finds it very liberating. I don't find it frightening. And this picture was taken, Ruth Orkin she was born back east, but she was raised an only child in Hollywood. Her mother was a silent screen actress. Her father made these little toy boats. And she had this very kind of great childhood. When she was 10, she started taking pictures. And when she was 17, and this is in the 1940s, she decided that she wanted to go to the 1939 New York World's Fair. So she got on her little bicycle and rode from California to New York City by herself to go see the World's Fair. And she took pictures along the way because she'd been taking pictures for a long time. She did a lot of different kinds of photography jobs. She was a nightclub photographer, and she was also assigned to take pictures of the Israel Philharmonic. And so she was coming back and going through Florence when she met Jinx Allen, and they decided to spend a day together. She took pictures of Jinx Allen, and what was I going to say? Sorry. So she took pictures of Jinx Allen, but that picture that you see of her walking down the street, it's what do I want to say? It's a planned picture, but it's also not. It's sort of serendipitous. She turned around, she saw Jinx walking down the street, and she said, just do it again and ask the men to act the same way. So it's planned, but it's not planned. So anyways, so this is Ruth Orkin. Here's one of the portraits she took. She did a lot of portraiture, as they all did. And this is a movie called The Little Fugitive. She met a man named Morris Engel, and they fell in love. They eventually married, and they made this movie together. And this movie was nominated for an Oscar, and Francois Truffaut says that this is the film that set off French New Wave. So it's a really important movie. And you can still rent it today. It's a great movie. And then there was a second one, which is also really good. And the third one, I don't think is as good. But the second one and the third one, she did not work on because by this time she was home with the kids. They started having children. And she was about 39, I think, or 40 when she had the first child. And so she's in this apartment all the time. She's not doing anything outside the apartment. I mean, she took some pictures, but what she does is she sets up 2 cameras in her window, and she starts taking pictures of the park and the New York skyline. And she does a series called The World Through My Window. And you see the changing season, the change of time during the day. You see how the people change in the park. You can see all the eras passing before your eyes. It's like time-lapse photography almost. And the pictures I'm going to show you are just some of them. She did a second set of more pictures through my window. But I love these pictures. I think they're great. And they also, for me, have always been really moving because I think here's this woman who rode her little bike when she was 17 years old across the United States. She traveled in Europe. She traveled to the Middle East at times when a lot of women didn't do that on their own. She came back. She made this important film. And then she ends up a housewife. And she often said, no one but a housewife could have done these pictures. You'd have to be like stuck someplace. Again, you can see more of these online. She did take pictures inside the apartment too. I mean, there's ones of her kids and her husband. And you've also seen other Ruth Orkin pictures because they do make note cards out of some of her pictures and mouse pads and I don't know who uses a mouse pad anymore, and calendars. Okay, this is the last picture, and this is the last picture in my book too. And in the same way that the Unmade Bed sort of opens the book, I feel like this crescent moon sort of shuts the book down. This is taken by a photographer named Camille Soliagua, and she lives in Portland. She took this in San Francisco in 1998. And it's a really simple picture, but I think it's very, very beautiful. And it also fits in with the final story in the book. And that's my slideshow. One more thing I should say about Lee Miller, too. With the surrealism, it does show up in her pictures a lot, too, in the same way that naturalism shows up in Imogen Cunningham or modernism shows up for Tina Modotti. And one of the things about surrealism, too, is that surrealism kind of comes out of World War I because no one had ever seen a war that cataclysmic before, and no one had ever seen the images of that. And so a lot of the artists that came out and were doing surrealism had been in the war and had seen things that were nightmarish. And so I think that was part of the influence of surrealism. And that was always Lee Miller's approach to photography too, was she liked the odd juxtapositions and stuff. And that's how she photographed a lot of the war pictures too. They've got kind of strange little moments in them sometimes. But anyways, okay, so that's it. So that was my PS, and that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And my book is fiction. It's not, it's not nonfiction. So yes.
Sort of an odd question, I guess, but in the scene where she's in the bathtub, there's a photograph of Hitler.
Yeah.
Yeah. Did he actually have that in his tub, in his bathroom, or?
I don't know. I think they probably put it there to sort of,
Make it all
look where I am. I'm in Hitler's bathtub.
There's a parallel between the women of Seneca Falls, 1848, and the women in this book, in that the fathers required these women to be educated. Not that they would use the education outside the home,
Yeah.
but that they were to be educated. And also, as the academics say, now you see her in part informs the women of this debate also. But I haven't read this one yet.
That's what I like to hear.
But I particularly love Now You See Her. Why, you might ask? Because I have not met anybody who has read one of the most beautiful books in the English language, which is West with the Night.
Oh, that's a great one.
Beryl Markham, who wouldn't even remotely understand the controversy between that third-rate Hollywood screenwriter and her, and the
Yeah.
debate over who wrote that book. She wrote that book.
Yeah.
And what I'd like to do is thank you for part of Now You See Her. I went to the medicine person this week, and I refused, medical tests, and they give you that squirrely look. So I referred to your book, which says basically be careful of the search for knowledge, because once you reach knowledge, it implies or suggests action.
Yeah.
And that whatever happens once you find the truth, you cannot go back to the way things were before. And that's what I told him. And
Oh, don't tell him I said that. No. Whitney Otto says. Oh, well, thank you. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, West with the Night, if you haven't read it, is phenomenal. It's a really wonderful book. And, and there's also that controversy, too, about To Kill a Mockingbird, where people have said, oh, well, she didn't do this. Truman Capote did, because they were very, very close friends, and they were together a lot from childhood on. And if you read Truman Capote's first book, Other Voices, Other Rooms, there's a little crossover there, not much, and but there is a couple of things. But I don't think for a second he wrote that book. I think she wrote it. I think Beryl Markham wrote her book. I think too, it's possible to write something and hand it over to someone and say, well, what do you think? And then you go back and rewrite. But that happens with every writer. There's no writer that really works without an editor.
Look at the gratitude list that every writer, I'd like to thank blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. So yes, I think that, but there is that. But yeah, it's true with the fathers. And I tell, well, since we're going to talk about my books, in my book, The Passion Dream book, there's a girl who in the Renaissance who, you know, is her father's apprentice, and he teaches her how to mix paints, and he teaches her how to paint, and he teaches her this. And at one point, she just has this breakdown where she's saying, you know, why did you bother teaching me at all? I can't use it anywhere. I can't go anywhere with it. And so in that way, too, with the women in this book, especially, it's like trying to carve out that life because you have been given something more, but society doesn't support it. And that's the other thing, too, in writing about men and women for me. And there's always a feminist edge to everything I write. But I don't think of men as villains. I don't think of this as, okay, you're the problem. It's sort of a societal issue that we have sometimes. And so, like, society could support these women or could have supported them, but it didn't. When Ruth Orkin stays home with the kids, given her era, he's not going to stay home with the kids, not because he would be unwilling to or because, you know, it's like, what, me? Stay home? Society didn't support him staying home and her going out necessarily. So you just sort of look at your family and you think, okay, you can make the money, you can get the job, I can't. I mean, you kind of have to sort of think of it in a more practical way. I mean, I think we live in a different time now, but certainly there's other issues that are going on, clearly, that are, you know, in the news all the time. But yeah, I think, yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm interested to hear your own views for starting this book. Was it a photographer, a photograph, or what?
These photographers are photographers I've loved since I was barely more than a girl. I've just always loved them, you know, and I didn't always know their lives. And as a matter of fact, I loved Lee Miller as an image before I realized that she was a photographer. A lot of people didn't know she was a photographer for a long time because I think they knew, and then it kind of fell out of favor. She's not, okay, I'm sorry, Lee, I have to say this. I don't think she's a great photographer. I think she's a good photographer, but I think that there are other people that are better. But she's really kind of a remarkable woman in her own right. But I always just loved these women. And I've always liked looking at art. I'm not a scholar or anything. I just like looking. And I sat down at one point, and I was going to write this other book. It was going to be this memoirish thing, and this is in the 90s. And I wanted to, part of it, 1/3 of it was going to be writing about my artistic heroes. And it was men and women. And there were a couple of novels in there. And I thought, oh, I'm just going to write about this. And sort of, this book was, you know, going to be about one thing or another. Well, then that morphed into, I'll just write about some women heroes. And then I realized so many of them were photographers. I thought, oh, well, then I'll just cut out everyone else and just write about photographers. And when I was going to do a nonfiction version of this, which I have mapped out and which I have a couple of 100 pages of, but I don't know if it'll ever see the light of day, they were kind of broken down into these different categories for me that they fell into really naturally. But then as I was doing that, I thought, but I also want to work with the same material fictionally, and I want to do it, you know, I wanted to do that experiment of having the same material but seeing what it looks like if it's fiction, it's nonfiction. So I put it down for quite a few years, and when I picked it up again, I just went right to the novel. And the novel is different from what I have of the nonfiction, and the novel sort of arranged itself in this arc of the 20th century, which was great for me, but whereas the nonfiction arranged itself in categories. And so there were people that I loved, but I was asked a lot when I said, well, I'm writing a book about, you know, these women photographers. They're like, oh, is it Margaret Bourke-White? Is it Cindy Sherman? You know, is it Nan Golden? You know, it's all the usual suspects. Is it Diane Arbus? And they've never been it for me. Like, I like their work. And there's a lot of women who are really obscure, whose work I also like. I love, actually. But once that this sort of core group coalesced, and partly because they've been my personal core group for so many years. It was, but I never set out to write about photography. It just sort of evolved.
I like that. Thank you.
Yeah.
As you're speaking, it's interesting to me to listen sort of to what seems to capture your attention most about the women that you're talking about. And there seems to be you speak with such an energy about some of their adventures.
Yeah.
And with such tone of admiration. And I'm wondering, in knowing them so well, clearly you've admired some of these photographers for a very long time, and then in really understanding who they are as you were researching the book, are there pieces that that you kind of took away from that research, that process, and applied to your own life in terms of, you know, models or a goal or anything that you sort of say, having done
Yeah.
this, my life turned in a way.
No, I wish. You know, I think as a writer, I'm more reticent, you know, I get very neurotic and phobic about things, of course, because I have way too much imagination and the internet. It's like, oh, if I didn't have hypochondria before, I think I have it now, because you can look up everything. And, you know, and it's really interesting, because like if you read about Lee Miller, for example, her life is extraordinary, like I said, up to age 40. At age 40, she does have a child. She does divorce one husband and marry another, but the husband she divorces, they hadn't lived together in like a million years. And she embarks on a whole other life, which includes being a gourmet cook, a surrealist gourmet cook. But her life, and she's an alcoholic for much of her life. So, but the life isn't really as interesting in a way, but of course I'm sure her energy level was different. But one of the things that she said, and as I said, if you read about her life, it's so amazing. She said, I wish I'd been less afraid. And I thought, oh man, if you were scared. Yeah, and so and I found that really interesting. I thought, wow, you know, I mean, you seem like the most, I mean, brave, but not in a heroic way, just brave in your own life way of hardly any women I've ever read about, and yet you still feel like, you know, you held back. I can't even imagine what it would look like if she didn't, because she really seemed very, not self-indulgent, but, you know, but adventurous and indulgent. Well, thank you very, very much, and I appreciate you coming out on this evening.